Just sit right here, Mama. We will go check in and come right back. Those were the exact words my father spoke to my 82-year-old grandmother in the middle of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport. I was supposed to be grabbing us coffees before our family vacation, but when I returned early, I caught my white brother-in-law slipping a state facility intake form and a one-way bus ticket into her lap. They were not taking her on vacation. They were throwing her away. I am Zara, 35 years old, and what I did next changed our family forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe family should protect you, not betray you. The noise of the airport terminal was deafening, a constant rush of rolling suitcases and overhead announcements. I balanced 3 overpriced coffees in a cardboard tray, navigating through the sea of travelers near the South Security checkpoint. We were supposed to be heading to Miami for a family getaway. My parents, Jerome and Vivian, had insisted on bringing Grandma Estelle along, claiming the ocean air would be good for her memory. I had my doubts given their usual selfishness, but I wanted to spend time with my grandmother. As I approached our designated meeting spot near the food court, something felt incredibly wrong. Grandma Estelle was sitting in a complimentary airport wheelchair, her frail hands clutching her favorite quilted purse. She was completely alone. My parents were nowhere in sight. But my sister Aaliyah's husband Trent was hovering over her. Trent was a man who wore his entitlement like a cheap cologne, always scheming for a quick payout while claiming to be a high-end real estate developer. I slowed my pace, the coffees growing heavy in my hands. Trent was looking around nervously, checking over his shoulder. He reached into his leather jacket, pulled out a manila folder, and hastily shoved it into the front pocket of Grandma Estelle's cardigan. Then he turned and fast-walked toward the first-class security line without a single backward glance. My heart hammered against my ribs. I practically dropped the drinks on a nearby table and rushed over to her. Grandma Estelle looked up at me, her brown eyes clouded with confusion. "Zara, baby," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Jerome said he was getting our tickets. Are we going to the farm now?" I knelt beside her wheelchair and gently pulled the folder from her cardigan. My hands shook as I opened it. There were no boarding passes inside. Instead, I found a one-way bus ticket to a town 3 hours away, clipped to a state-run nursing facility intake form. It was a transfer order declaring her an indigent ward of the state. I read the words over and over, my mind struggling to comprehend the absolute evil of what I was looking at. They were not taking her on a family vacation. They were dumping her in an underfunded state facility, where she would simply be a number forgotten and alone. Anger, hot and blinding, flared in my chest. I secured the folder in my designer tote bag, locked the brakes on her wheelchair, and told a passing airport attendant to watch her for exactly 2 minutes. I sprinted toward the first-class security lane. I spotted them immediately. My father, Jerome, in his tailored suit, my mother, Vivian, adjusting her silk scarf, and Trent chatting with my sister, Aaliyah, who was busy checking her reflection in her phone camera. They were laughing, actually laughing. I shoved my way past a family of 4 and grabbed my mother's shoulder. Vivian spun around, her practiced smile instantly melting into a scowl of annoyance when she saw me. "What on earth are you doing, Zara?" she hissed, grabbing my wrist and pulling me out of the main walkway to avoid a scene. "You are supposed to be sitting with your grandmother." I pulled my arm free, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Where are you going, Mom? Because it is definitely not Miami." My father stepped in, puffing out his chest in that intimidating way he always used to win arguments. "Keep your voice down. We made a difficult family decision. Estelle's condition is deteriorating. She needs professional care that we simply cannot provide. We arranged for a transport service to pick her up from the terminal. It is for the best." "A transport service," I repeated, pulling the cheap bus ticket from my bag and shoving it against his chest. "You bought her a $30 bus ticket and abandoned her near a trash can with a state facility form. You did not even have the decency to take her there yourselves." Aaliyah rolled her eyes, flipping her long hair over her shoulder. "Oh, please, Zara, stop acting like the martyr. She does not even know what day it is half the time. Trent and I have a business to run, and Mom and Dad deserve a break. They paid for my massive wedding last year. The least you could do is pay for her care. I glared at my sister, the golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life, whose entire existence and lavish lifestyle was subsidized by my parents while I paid off my own student loans. And where exactly are you all taking a break to? Vivian stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with that familiar disdain she reserved exclusively for me. Stop making a scene, Zara. Just because you chose your little spreadsheets over having a husband does not mean you get to dictate how we handle this burden. You are just a wealth manager. You have no idea what it takes to manage a real family. Her words were meant to cut a direct jab at my independence and my career. For 35 years, I had been the reliable, boring daughter who fixed their messes while Aaliyah received all the praise. But I was not the insecure girl they used to bully. I looked past her, my eyes scanning the departure board above their heads. I traced the flight number printed on Trent's boarding pass, which was peeking out of his jacket pocket. Flight 482, destination Savannah, Georgia. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Miami was a lie. The nursing home was a distraction. They were flying to South Georgia. Savannah was less than an hour away from Grandma Estelle's most prized possession, a 500-acre historic farm that had been in our family for generations. The land was sitting on a massive, highly coveted stretch of pristine waterfront property. My stomach plummeted as the sheer scale of their betrayal hit me. They were not just getting rid of an elderly woman. They were clearing the path to steal her legacy. They needed her declared incompetent and locked away in a state facility so Jerome could seize control of the estate and sell it out from under her to Trent's shady development firm. I looked at my father, the man who had taught me to ride a bike, who was now willingly discarding his own mother for a payout. My mother crossed her arms, tapping her foot impatiently. Go back to the food court, Zara. Wait for the medical transport. Do not complicate this. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply looked at all four of them, memorizing the smug, comfortable expressions on their faces. Enjoy your flight, I said, my voice eerily calm. I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not go to the food court to wait for a bus. I went back to my grandmother, my mind already running complex financial algorithms and legal strategies. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought throwing away the matriarch of our family would be a simple transaction. But as I pulled out my phone and canceled my return flight to New York, I knew they had made a fatal miscalculation. They were about to find out exactly what happens when you try to con a senior financial investigator. We are going home, Grandma, I whispered, taking the handles of her wheelchair. I rented a luxury SUV, and we started the drive south. But as we pulled into the long dirt driveway of the farm hours later, my blood ran cold. A massive sign was already hammered into the soil of our family farm, reading "Sold to Trent Developments," and the heavy front doors had fresh silver locks shining in the moonlight. I wheeled Grandma Estelle straight up to the priority counter. The departure board above us glowed with a flight to Savannah leaving in exactly 40 minutes. I slapped my everyday debit card onto the sleek counter and demanded 2 first-class seats on that plane. The ticketing agent typed, rapidly swiped the card, and frowned as the machine beeped a harsh, flat rejection. She tried again. Declined. I pulled up my mobile banking app expecting a simple fraud alert triggered by a last-minute airport purchase. Instead, the screen loaded to display a balance of zero, $32,000 wiped out in a single transaction. I clicked into the recent activity log. There it was. A wire transfer initiated by Jerome Washington. My father had exploited a forgotten custodial loophole from a basic checking account he helped me open during my freshman year at Howard University. I had kept the account active purely out of convenience, using it to automatically pay his and my mother's cell phone bills, because they were always complaining about being short on cash. It was a gesture of daughterly duty that he had just weaponized against me. He drained every single cent I had in that account. Before the initial shock could fully register, my phone vibrated violently against my palm. A text message popped up from my sister Aaliyah. It was a selfie. She and her white husband Trent were nestled deep into plush first-class leather seats. They were clinking crystal champagne flutes, flashing overly whitened smiles. Trent wore a smug grin, looking incredibly pleased with himself for a man who had not earned a legitimate paycheck in 5 years. Aaliyah's caption read, "Dad said consider the cash payback for the wedding you refused to pay for. Bon voyage." The sheer audacity of that text made my blood boil right there in the terminal. My mind flashed back to last spring. Aaliyah had stomped into my office and demanded I liquidate my stock options to finance her $150,000 destination wedding. I refused to write a blank check for her to marry Trent. He was a walking red flag, a man whose entire personality consisted of wearing expensive sneakers and boasting about his real estate development company. In reality, his business was a failing shell corporation, drowning in civil lawsuits and unpaid contractor disputes. When I told Aaliyah I would not bankroll her mistake, my parents absolutely lost their minds. They called me a jealous, bitter spinster who resented my beautiful younger sister. They uninvited me from the rehearsal dinner and spent the entire year punishing me for holding my financial boundaries. Now they thought they had finally broken me. They thought stripping me of 30 grand would leave me stranded, humiliated, and powerless at gate 24. They genuinely believed I would be forced to hand my grandmother over to the state transport service because I could not afford to fight them. The ticketing agent looked at me with polite pity, offering to let me use her phone to call my bank. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed over the terminal noise. I did not need to call the bank. I am a senior wealth manager for one of the most ruthless financial firms in Manhattan. I manage generational wealth for clients who buy private islands just to avoid paying property taxes. Did Jerome and Vivian honestly believe I kept my actual net worth in a basic checking account tied to a college custodial link? That 30 grand was my decoy money. It was a financial mousetrap I left open because I knew my father's desperate greed would eventually get the better of him. He took the bait, and by wiring those funds across state lines without my authorization, he had just legally committed federal wire fraud. I filed that information away in my mind to use as ammunition later. I reached into the hidden zipper compartment of my designer tote bag and pulled out my heavy matte black American Express Centurion card. I dropped the solid metal on the counter with a heavy thud. The ticketing agent's eyes widened immediately, recognizing the card. Unfortunately, she typed frantically into her system, only to inform me that the Savannah flight was completely overbooked. No amount of money or elite status could bump two passengers this close to departure. Waiting for the next available flight would take 6 long hours. I did not have 6 hours. Trent and my parents were moving fast to steal my grandmother's land, and I needed to move faster. I grabbed the handles of Grandma Estelle's wheelchair and pivoted sharply away from the departure gates. We headed straight down the escalator to the executive car rental concourse. I bypassed the standard lines full of stressed travelers and walked right up to the VIP concierge desk, sliding my black card across the pristine glass. "Give me the fastest, heaviest luxury SUV you have on the lot," I told the clerk, "and I need the keys right now." 5 minutes later, I was lifting my grandmother out of the wheelchair and buckling her into the heated leather passenger seat of a brand new Cadillac Escalade. I adjusted the seatbelt across her fragile shoulders, making sure she was warm and comfortable. She looked at me, her hands gripping her quilted purse, still confused by the sudden rush. "They thought they could erase you to steal our legacy," I said, leaning in so she could hear the absolute resolve in my voice. "They thought I was just some pushover who would cry and walk away, but they forgot exactly who raised me." "We are going home, Grandma." I slammed the heavy door shut, climbed into the driver's seat, and pressed my foot hard down on the accelerator. We tore out of the airport parking garage, the tires squealing as I pointed the massive vehicle south toward the Georgia state line. I was ready for war, but nothing could have prepared me for the devastating sight we would find waiting for us at the end of that long dirt driveway. The midnight drive from Atlanta to Savannah felt like descending into another world. The sleek tires of my rented Cadillac Escalade devoured the miles of dark asphalt, while the thick, humid Georgia air pressed against the tinted windows. Beside me in the passenger seat, Grandma Estelle slept fitfully, her chest rising and falling in a shallow rhythm. I kept the radio off, letting the hum of the engine ground my racing thoughts. My mind was calculating variables, analyzing the legal exposure of my father's wire fraud, and dissecting the sheer audacity of my family's betrayal. But beneath the cold logic of the wealth manager, a deeper primal anger was brewing. We were crossing into territory that belonged to my bloodline. This was not just real estate to be liquidated, it was our anchor. The paved highway gave way to cracked asphalt and finally to the familiar crunch of the crushed gravel road leading to the farm. I rolled down my window, letting the scent of damp earth and sweet pine flood the cabin. It was the smell of my childhood of summers spent running through the pecan groves while my grandfather taught me how to read the soil. He had bought this land piece by piece, working until his hands bled, so his descendants would always have a place in this world. A place no bank and no white man could ever take away from us. It was a testament to survival, a sanctuary built by black hands during a time when owning land was a dangerous revolutionary act. But as we rounded the final bend toward the main property, a harsh, unnatural glare blinded me. I slammed on the brakes, the heavy SUV skidding slightly in the loose gravel. Grandma Estelle jolted awake, gasping softly, clutching her purse to her chest. Industrial floodlights were rigged to a portable generator, casting a blinding white halo over the front lawn. And there, hammered deep into the century-old soil of my ancestors, was a massive, glossy billboard. I threw the SUV into park and stared at the bold black letters printed against a pristine white background. Sold to Trent Developments, future site of the Magnolia Golf Resort. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. A golf resort. My brother-in-law Trent, a man who had never done a day of honest labor in his life, planned to pave over 500 acres of rich black history to build a playground for his wealthy country club investors. He was going to bulldoze the pecan groves where my grandfather proposed to my grandmother. He was going to flatten the pastures that our family had defended through decades of systemic discrimination and economic hardship. He was going to whitewash our legacy, erase our name from the county records, and name his sterile manicured country club after a flower. I unbuckled my seatbelt, my vision narrowing to a tunnel of pure white-hot rage. "Stay right here, Grandma," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I will be right back." I pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the muggy night. The ground around the sign had been recently churned by heavy machinery, preparing the earth for destruction. As soon as my foot hit the ground, the wet red Georgia clay swallowed my designer stilettos, ruining $1,000 worth of Italian leather in an instant. I did not care. I marched straight into the mud, the wet clay splattering against the hem of my tailored slacks with every step. I reached the billboard and wrapped my bare hands around the thick wooden posts anchoring it to the ground. The wood was rough, digging into my palms, but I gripped it tighter. I thought about my mother Vivian sneering at me in the airport terminal, calling me a burden because I chose my career over a superficial marriage. I thought about my father Jerome stealing my decoy money and dumping his own vulnerable mother at a departure gate like unwanted luggage. I thought about Aaliyah sipping champagne in first class while selling out her own bloodline to fund her luxury lifestyle. And I thought about Trent, an outsider stepping onto this sacred ground, thinking he could simply plant his corporate flag on land that held the sweat and tears of my people. I planted my ruined heels deep into the mud, bent my knees, and pulled with every ounce of strength I had in my body. The wooden posts groaned, resisting my grip. I yanked again, twisting the heavy frame back and forth, letting the primal fury of generations fuel my muscles. The soil yielded with a sickening squelch. I ripped the massive sign entirely out of the ground, hoisting it up for a fraction of a second before violently hurling it face down into the mud. The industrial floodlights cast harsh shadows over the splintered wood and the trampled grass. I stood over it, breathing heavily, wiping a streak of sweat and dirt from my cheek, feeling a fierce, protective satisfaction burning in my veins. The sudden loud creak of the wraparound porch steps shattered the midnight silence. The heavy, original oak front door of the farmhouse swung open. The porch lights flicked on, bathing the wooden planks in a yellow glow. Trent stepped out of the house. He was wearing expensive silk pajamas and holding a 12-gauge shotgun, resting the dark metal barrel casually against his shoulder. He looked down at me, standing in the mud over his ruined sign. A smug, condescending smirk spread across his face, completely devoid of any guilt. "You are trespassing, Zara Trent," called out his voice echoing across the silent property with arrogant certainty. Your daddy signed the power of attorney yesterday. Leave the old lady and get off my land before I call the sheriff. Trent stood on the wraparound porch with the stock of the 12-gauge tucked awkwardly against his shoulder. His knuckles were white and his breath was shallow. He was a man who spent his weekends at manicured country clubs trying to impress men wealthier than him. He had absolutely no idea how to hold a firearm, and we both knew it. I stared right down the dark barrel of the shotgun and felt absolutely nothing but contempt. "You are trespassing, Zara!" Trent stammered, his voice pitching up an octave as he tried to sound intimidating. "Your daddy signed the power of attorney yesterday. Leave the old lady and get off my land before I call the sheriff." I did not raise my hands. I did not flinch. I calmly reached into my leather tote bag. Trent's eyes widened and the barrel of the gun wavered, but I did not stop my movement. My fingers closed around the cold, heavy metal I was looking for. I pulled out a massive antique brass key. It was the original key to the farmhouse forged over a century ago. My grandfather had handed it to me on my 18th birthday and told me to never let it out of my sight. I stepped up onto the porch, leaving my mud-ruined designer heels by the bottom step. I walked in my stocking feet right past Trent. The barrel of his shotgun practically brushed my shoulder, but I did not even look at him. I slid the heavy brass key into the original oak door. It turned with a deep, satisfying click that echoed in the humid night air. Before Trent could even process what was happening, I pushed the door open and immediately reached behind the doorframe. I flipped open a hidden panel and punched a 5-digit code into an alarm keypad. A sharp beep confirmed the system was disarmed. Trent lowered the shotgun, his jaw hanging slack. "How did you do that?" he demanded, stepping toward the doorway. "There is no active alarm on this property. Jerome told me the power was shut off months ago." "Jerome tells you exactly what you want to hear, Trent," I replied smoothly, guiding Grandma Estelle's wheelchair over the threshold and into the main hallway. I flipped a switch, and the vintage chandelier bathed the room in warm light. "I pay the utility bills on this estate directly through a private holding company. You really should do your due diligence before you claim to own a property." I wheeled Grandma Estelle into the large farmhouse kitchen. The room smelled of lemon oil and the sweet pine of the original floorboards. I walked over to the porcelain sink, grabbed a glass from the drying rack, and poured her some fresh water from the filtered pitcher in the refrigerator. Trent followed us inside his heavy boots, tracking mud onto the pristine rugs. He leaned the shotgun against the wall, finally realizing how ridiculous he looked holding it. He crossed his arms, trying to regain his shattered authority. "You can play house all you want, Zara, but it does not change the facts. Jerome gave me the deed transfer this morning. I have the notarized power of attorney. Your grandmother is legally incompetent, and your father authorized the sale of this land to my development firm. It is a done deal." I handed the glass of water to Grandma Estelle. She took a slow sip, her eyes sharp and watchful as she took in the familiar surroundings of her kitchen. I turned to face my brother-in-law, leaning comfortably against the counter. "Trent, you really are as stupid as my sister," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You think Jerome has the power to sell this farm just because he forced a fake medical evaluation on a woman he dumped at an airport? Let me give you a free lesson in generational wealth management. My grandfather did not just leave a simple will when he passed away. He knew exactly who my father was. He knew Jerome was weak and greedy, and he knew Vivian would sell her own soul for a designer handbag. So my grandfather did not leave this land to Jerome. He placed every single acre of this farm into an irrevocable historic trust." Trent's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a sneer. "A trust. Jerome said there was no trust. Jerome and Vivian have spent the last 10 years pretending the trust did not exist, because they could not break it," I explained, watching the reality slowly dawn on his face. "The trust explicitly states that this land can never be sold to commercial developers. It cannot be subdivided. It cannot be paved over for a golf course. My father was named a temporary trustee, which is a position he legally forfeited the moment he signed a fraudulent deed transfer to your failing shell company. Your paperwork is garbage, Trent. You do not own anything but a very expensive and very illegal billboard on my front lawn. For a moment, the kitchen was completely silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Trent stared at me, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and finally a cold, calculating realization. He uncrossed his arms and let out a loud, mocking laugh that bounced off the high ceilings. He ran a hand through his expensive haircut and shook his head, looking at me with pure condescension. "You think you are so smart, Zara?" Trent chuckled, stepping closer to the kitchen island. "You think some dusty old piece of paper is going to stop my investors? You can quote trust law to me all night, but you are missing one massive detail. An irrevocable trust does not mean a thing if the property is seized by the government." I kept my face entirely blank, waiting for him to play his trump card. "Jerome is not just greedy, Zara. He is actually pretty clever." Trent gloated, leaning across the marble counter. "He stopped paying the property taxes on this farm 5 years ago. He let the debt pile up on purpose. The county is foreclosing on this entire estate tonight at exactly midnight. In 2 hours, this land reverts to the state, and my investors are wiring the cash directly to the county tomorrow morning to buy it free and clear of your little historic trust. You lose. You do not have the liquid cash to cover 5 years of back taxes and penalties before the clock strikes 12. I looked at the grandfather clock on the wall. It was 10:15 in the evening. I took a slow sip of water from a spare glass, placed it gently on the marble counter, and offered Trent a bright, terrifying smile. "Who do you think bought the debt, Trent?" I did not wait for Trent's brain to process my words. I simply turned around and walked away from the heavy oak door, leaving him staring through the reinforced glass sidelights. He began pounding his fists against the wood, yelling muffled threats about sheriffs and trespassing, but the century-old walls of my grandfather's house easily absorbed his tantrums. I guided Grandma Estelle into the formal living room, settling her into her favorite floral armchair with a soft fleece blanket over her knees. "Rest now, Grandma," I told her, my voice gentle but vibrating with a new dangerous energy. "I have some work to do." I pulled my encrypted company laptop from my tote bag and set it on the solid mahogany dining table. As a senior wealth manager in Manhattan, my daily life involved untangling the complex, often dirty financial webs of the ultra-rich. Tracking down the clumsy, desperate paper trail of Jerome Washington and his fraudulent son-in-law was child's play. I connected to the secure satellite hotspot I always carried and went to work. I called it a financial autopsy. You cut open the bank statements, peel back the tax returns, and you find exactly what killed the patient. First on the table was Trent Developments. Trent loved to boast at Thanksgiving dinners about his booming real estate empire, flashing a Rolex he clearly could not afford. It took me less than 12 minutes of accessing public corporate registries and federal litigation databases to expose his entire life as a complete hallucination. Trent Developments was nothing but a hollow shell corporation. It held zero actual assets and employed no actual staff. Instead, it was drowning in 7 active civil lawsuits from unpaid contractors, stiffed material suppliers, and 2 different regional banks suing him for defaulting on massive commercial loans. He was not a real estate developer. He was a professional con artist, running a localized Ponzi scheme, desperately trying to use my grandmother's pristine 500 acres as collateral to bail himself out of absolute financial ruin. But Trent's pathetic scam did not explain why my parents, who supposedly had their own comfortable retirement, were so eager to participate in this grand theft. Jerome and Vivian worshipped social status. They would never associate with a documented failure like Trent unless they were equally desperate. I shifted my search parameters, running deep background checks on my parents' social security numbers, accessing credit bureaus and county property tax records. The numbers loaded onto my screen, painting a picture of absolute terrifying desperation. My parents were completely, unequivocally bankrupt. Their shiny life in Atlanta, the country club memberships, the luxury leased cars, the designer wardrobes was entirely funded by a mountain of toxic debt. Jerome had defaulted on his primary mortgage 3 times in the last 24 months. He was currently under active investigation by the IRS for severe tax evasion. Then I noticed the credit cards. Dozens of high-limit maximum balance credit lines opened within the last 2 years. But the primary account holder was not Jerome or Vivian. It was Aaliyah. My parents had systematically stolen my sister's identity, opening massive lines of credit in her name to fund their facade, maxing them out entirely and leaving Aaliyah holding the bag. Aaliyah thought she was the golden child sipping champagne in first class, blissfully unaware that her own parents had financially ruined her before her 30th birthday. They used her like a human ATM to keep up appearances. This was never about paying for Aaliyah's lavish wedding, and it was never about moving Estelle into a care facility. It was about survival. Jerome and Vivian were facing imminent federal prison time for tax fraud and identity theft. They needed a massive, untraceable cash injection to pay off the IRS and silence their angry creditors. Selling this historic farm to Trent's phantom investors was their get-out-of-jail-free card. They dumped Estelle at Gate 24 because she was the only obstacle standing between them and a federal indictment. I closed my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off the dark wood of the dining table. Digital proof was powerful, but I needed the physical documents. I needed the forged power of attorney and the original deed transfer Jerome had supposedly signed to hand this property over to Trent. I left the dining room and walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward my grandfather's old study, a room Jerome had commandeered as his personal office whenever they visited the farm. The study smelled of stale cigars and cheap cologne. The heavy wooden desk was a chaotic mess of discarded mail, half-empty coffee mugs, and scattered legal pads. I began rifling through the drawers, pulling out bank statements that perfectly matched the digital ruin I had just uncovered on my laptop. I found past due notices stamped with bright red urgent warnings letters from the IRS threatening wage garnishment and drafted emails to Trent begging for a cash advance on the farm sale. They were sloppy. Absolute desperation makes people incredibly sloppy. I moved behind the heavy leather desk chair to check the filing cabinets. As I knelt down to pull open the bottom drawer, my knee bumped against the metal trash can tucked into the corner. The can tipped over, spilling its contents across the vintage Persian rug. I reached down to clean up the mess of crumpled papers and junk mail, but my hand stopped mid-air. Rolling across the intricate patterns of the rug were 3 empty amber-colored prescription pill bottles. I picked one up, turning the label toward the dim light of the desk lamp. The name on the prescription was not Jerome or Vivian. It was Estelle Washington. But my grandmother did not have a prescription for this medication. I stared at the bold black lettering on the label, recognizing the name of the drug immediately from my days auditing pharmaceutical portfolios. It was not blood pressure medication or arthritis treatment. It was a heavy, unauthorized black market sedative typically used for severe psychiatric sedation. I did not wait for Trent's brain to process my words. I simply turned around and walked away from the heavy oak door, leaving him staring through the reinforced glass sidelights. He began pounding his fists against the wood, yelling muffled threats about sheriffs and trespassing, but the century-old walls of my grandfather's house easily absorbed his tantrums. I guided Grandma Estelle into the formal living room, settling her into her favorite floral armchair, with a soft fleece blanket over her knees. "Rest now, Grandma," I told her, my voice gentle, but vibrating with a new, dangerous energy. "I have some work to do." I pulled my encrypted company laptop from my tote bag and set it on the solid mahogany dining table. As a senior wealth manager in Manhattan, my daily life involved untangling the complex, often dirty financial webs of the ultra-rich. Tracking down the clumsy, desperate paper trail of Jerome Washington and his fraudulent son-in-law was child's play. I connected to the secure satellite hotspot I always carried and went to work. I called it a financial autopsy. You cut open the bank statements, peel back the tax returns, and you find exactly what killed the patient. First on the table was Trent Developments. Trent loved to boast at Thanksgiving dinners about his booming real estate empire, flashing a Rolex he clearly could not afford. It took me less than 12 minutes of accessing public corporate registries and federal litigation databases to expose his entire life as a complete hallucination. Trent Developments was nothing but a hollow shell corporation. It held zero actual assets and employed no actual staff. Instead, it was drowning in 7 active civil lawsuits from unpaid contractors, stiffed material suppliers, and 2 different regional banks suing him for defaulting on massive commercial loans. He was not a real estate developer. He was a professional con artist running a localized Ponzi scheme, desperately trying to use my grandmother's pristine 500 acres as collateral to bail himself out of absolute financial ruin. But Trent's pathetic scam did not explain why my parents, who supposedly had their own comfortable retirement, were so eager to participate in this grand theft. Jerome and Vivian worshipped social status. They would never associate with a documented failure like Trent unless they were equally desperate. I shifted my search parameters, running deep background checks on my parents' social security numbers, accessing credit bureaus, and county property tax records. The numbers loaded onto my screen painting a picture of absolute terrifying desperation. My parents were completely unequivocally bankrupt. Their shiny life in Atlanta, the country club memberships, the luxury leased cars, the designer wardrobes, was entirely funded by a mountain of toxic debt. Jerome had defaulted on his primary mortgage 3 times in the last 24 months. He was currently under active investigation by the Internal Revenue Service for severe tax evasion. Then I noticed the credit cards. Dozens of high-limit maximum balance credit lines opened within the last 2 years. But the primary account holder was not Jerome or Vivian. It was Aaliyah. My parents had systematically stolen my sister's identity, opening massive lines of credit in her name to fund their facade, maxing them out entirely, and leaving Aaliyah holding the bag. Aaliyah thought she was the golden child sipping champagne in first class, blissfully unaware that her own parents had financially ruined her before her 30th birthday. They used her like a human ATM to keep up appearances. This was never about paying for Aaliyah's lavish destination wedding, and it was never about moving Estelle into an assisted care facility. The financial records proved their entire image was a fragile, paper-thin facade. They did not sell the farm to help the family. They sold it to keep themselves out of federal prison. They needed a massive, untraceable cash injection to pay off the IRS and silence their angry creditors. I closed my laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting off the dark wood of the dining table. Digital proof was powerful, but I needed the physical documents. I needed the forged power of attorney and the original deed transfer Jerome had supposedly signed to hand this property over to Trent. I left the dining room and walked down the long, shadowed hallway toward my grandfather's old study, a room Jerome had commandeered as his personal office whenever they visited the farm. The study smelled of stale cigars and cheap cologne. The heavy wooden desk was a chaotic mess of discarded mail, half-empty coffee mugs, and scattered legal pads. I began rifling through the drawers looking for the physical paper trail. As I knelt down to pull open the bottom drawer, my knee bumped against the metal trash can tucked into the corner. The can tipped over, spilling its contents across the vintage Persian rug. I reached down to clean up the mess of crumpled papers, but my hand stopped mid-air. Rolling across the intricate patterns of the rug were 3 empty, amber-colored prescription pill bottles. I picked one up, turning the label toward the dim light of the desk lamp. The name on the prescription was not Jerome or Vivian, it was Estelle Washington. But my grandmother did not have a prescription for this medication. I stared at the bold black lettering on the label, recognizing the name of the drug immediately from my days auditing pharmaceutical portfolios. It was not blood pressure medication or arthritis treatment. It was a heavy, unauthorized black market sedative typically used for severe psychiatric sedation. The pieces of my parents' sinister puzzle snapped together with horrifying absolute clarity. Jerome and Vivian had not just been neglecting my grandmother. They had been intentionally and systematically over-medicating her. They needed Trent's fake real estate money to keep themselves out of a federal penitentiary, but to sell the farm, they needed legal control over the estate. And the only way to seize control of an irrevocable historic trust was to prove the primary trustee was entirely mentally incompetent. My parents had chemically induced a state of severe late-stage dementia just to trick a county notary into signing over the power of attorney. They had chemically lobotomized the matriarch of our family for a payout. I crushed the empty plastic bottle in my fist until the plastic cracked and splintered in my palm. The sheer evil of it was breathtaking. I dropped the broken plastic into the trash bin and sprinted out of the study down the long shadowed hallway and back into the formal living room. Grandma Estelle was still sitting in her floral armchair where I had left her. But the woman occupying that chair had fundamentally changed. The slack-jawed, vacant stare that had clouded her beautiful features for the past 6 months was completely gone. The heavy black market sedatives my parents had pumped into her system before fleeing to the airport were finally metabolizing and wearing off. As I walked into the room, Estelle sat up straight. She pushed the soft fleece blanket off her knees and planted her feet firmly on the original hardwood floor. She turned her head and looked directly at me. Her dark eyes were piercingly sharp clear and burning with a fierce, lucid intensity that commanded immediate respect. Zara Estelle said, her voice raspy but entirely steady. "You found the bottles." It was not a question. She looked toward the hallway leading to the study. I rushed to her side, dropping to my knees next to her chair and taking her frail hands in mine. They were warm and gripping me with surprising, desperate strength. "Yes, Grandma, I found them. I am going to put them in a federal prison for what they did to you. I will dismantle their entire lives." Estelle let out a long, shaky breath. "They thought I did not know, Zara." She whispered, the heartbreak in her voice battling with a profound, simmering rage. "They looked right at me and talked about selling my land, liquidating my life, treating me like a piece of broken furniture. They thought the drugs made me deaf and blind. But I was awake inside my own mind. I knew every time Vivian crushed those pills into my sweet tea, Zara. I tasted the bitterness, but my body was too heavy to fight back. I could not lift my arms. I could not move my tongue to scream when Jerome brought that notary into my kitchen and guided my limp hand across the signature line. I was a prisoner inside my own flesh, while my own son robbed me blind. I felt hot tears prick my eyes, but I forced them back. My grandmother had survived the Jim Crow South. She had marched for civil rights. She had built a thriving farming empire out of red clay and pure sweat. To be stripped of her agency by her own greedy child was a betrayal so deep it defied language. I squeezed her hands tighter. "You are safe now," I promised her, looking up into her fierce dark eyes. "Trent is locked out of the house. His entire company is a sham. Jerome and Vivian are bankrupt and facing federal indictment. The tax debt they tried to use against us has already been bought and paid for by me. This farm is ours and no one is taking you anywhere." Estelle smiled a slow, proud smile that smoothed the deep lines of her face. "I knew my girl would not let them win," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You always had your grandfather's fire. But Jerome is desperate, Zara. A desperate man who is out of time will try to burn down the whole house just to stay warm. Do not underestimate how far they will go to hide their sins." Before I could reply, a sudden piercing wail shattered the quiet intimacy of the living room. It was not the farm alarm system. It was the high-pitched, alternating shriek of police sirens. Brilliant flashing lights, red and blue, violently sliced through the darkness outside, casting frantic, strobing shadows against the floral wallpaper. The heavy crunch of multiple vehicle tires tearing up the gravel driveway signaled that we were no longer alone. I stood up quickly, moving to the large bay window and pulling back the heavy velvet curtain just enough to see out onto the lawn. 2 county sheriff cruisers were parked haphazardly near my rented Escalade, their light bars fully illuminated. And stepping out of the lead vehicle was my sister Aaliyah. She had clearly just arrived from the airport, her designer luggage abandoned in the mud. She was marching toward the front porch, pointing frantically at the house. Trent was emerging from the shadows of the pecan grove, running to meet her and shouting at the officers. "She is in there!" Aaliyah screamed, her voice carrying easily through the old glass panes. "She locked my husband out. She is completely unhinged. You have to break the door down right now." My sister Zara stole my grandmother's wheelchair at the airport and forced her into a car. She has kidnapped a mentally incompetent senior citizen and we need to rescue her right now. I let the heavy velvet curtain fall back into place. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the gaps in the fabric, painting the living room walls in frantic, pulsing colors. The harsh glare illuminated my grandmother, who was sitting tall in her floral armchair, her hands resting calmly on her lap. Her eyes were sharp, locked onto mine with a silent, ironclad resolve. I gave her a single nod, tucked my laptop under my arm, and walked to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped back out onto the wraparound porch. The humid Georgia air clung to my skin immediately. My sister Aaliyah was in peak performance mode. She had thrown herself against the side of the nearest police cruiser, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with exaggerated theatrical sobs. Aaliyah had been perfecting this exact routine since she was 4 years old, using weaponized tears to play the victim and paint me as the villain whenever it suited her needs. She took her, Aaliyah wailed, pointing a manicured finger at me as I stood under the porch light. My sister has been completely estranged from this family for years. She is bitter, she is financially unstable, and she just hijacked our helpless grandmother from the airport to extort us for ransom money. You have to break that door down and save her. The two local deputies exchanged a glance. They looked at Trent standing nearby in his expensive silk pajamas, trying to look like a distressed property owner. They looked at Aaliyah in her designer travel gear, playing the part of the wealthy, terrified suburban daughter to perfection. Then they looked up at me standing barefoot on the porch of an old farmhouse. They made a snap judgment based on pure superficial aesthetics. The older deputy placed a heavy hand on his utility belt and marched up the wooden steps, his boots thudding aggressively against the planks. "Ma'am, you need to step aside right now," the deputy ordered, his voice dripping with tired, condescending authority. "We are here to escort Mrs. Washington back into the safe custody of her legal guardians. Do not make this difficult, or we will be forced to place you under arrest for kidnapping a vulnerable, mentally incompetent senior citizen." I did not raise my voice. I did not cross my arms, and I certainly did not panic. I simply reached into the leather tote bag hanging from my shoulder and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I held it out to the deputy. He hesitated for a second, thrown off by my absolute calm, before he snatched it from my hand. He clicked on his heavy tactical flashlight and shone the bright beam onto the documents inside. "Before you put your hands on me or even think about crossing this threshold," I said, my voice cutting through the humid night air with lethal, chilling clarity, "you should probably read the first page. What you are holding is a comprehensive cognitive assessment." I suspected my parents were hiding something, so I quietly commissioned a private board-certified neurologist to examine my grandmother in Atlanta exactly 3 weeks ago. Aaliyah stopped crying instantly. Her hands dropped from her face, her fake sobs vanishing into the thick night air. Her eyes darted wildly between me and the deputy, the color draining from her perfectly contoured cheeks. "That medical file proves Estelle Washington has a perfectly healthy, highly functioning brain." I continued, stepping down one stair so I was directly at eye level with the officer. "She has 0 markers for dementia, 0 signs of Alzheimer's, and absolutely no cognitive decline. Which means the medical evaluation my father presented to the county notary yesterday is a complete and total fabrication." The deputy blinked, shining his light closer onto the embossed seals and medical signatures validating the paperwork. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held the glowing screen up for both deputies to see. "This is a confirmation receipt," I told them. 10 minutes ago, while Trent was throwing a tantrum outside, I filed an emergency toxicology screen order with the State Department of Health and Adult Protective Services. I just found empty bottles of black market psychiatric sedatives in my father's trash can inside this house. My parents have not been neglecting my grandmother. They have been intentionally poisoning her to induce a chemically simulated state of severe dementia just so they could trick a notary and steal this farm. The older deputy lowered his flashlight, his face going completely slack. He looked at the official state seals on the paperwork, then looked back at Aaliyah, who was now frozen in terror against the police cruiser. "If you try to remove my grandmother from this property and hand her over to these people," I said, leaning in, so only the deputies could hear the absolute finality in my tone, "you are actively participating in the kidnapping and endangerment of an abused elder." You are stepping right into the middle of a massive federal crime scene involving high-level financial fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder by poisoning. I am a senior wealth manager in Manhattan, and I have already forwarded the financial paper trail to my corporate legal team. So please, deputies, tell me exactly how you want to proceed tonight. The older deputy stepped backward so fast he nearly tripped down the stairs. He took his hand completely off his belt and held both palms up in a gesture of surrender. He looked at Trent, who was suddenly sweating profusely despite the cool night breeze. "This is a civil matter," the deputy stammered, thrusting the manila folder back into my chest. "Actually, with these specific allegations, this is a federal matter. This is entirely out of our jurisdiction. We are leaving." The deputies practically sprinted back to their cruisers. They did not even glance at Aaliyah or Trent as they slammed their heavy doors through the vehicles into reverse and sped down the gravel driveway, turning off their flashing lights as they fled into the dark. Aaliyah stood alone in the mud, her designer travel clothes splattered with red clay. The mask of the concerned, grieving granddaughter was completely gone. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She stomped toward the porch, her fists clenched so tightly at her sides that her knuckles were white. "It does not matter!" Aaliyah spat, her voice shaking with desperate fury as she glared up at me. "Dad already filed the deed transfer with the county. Trent's billionaire investors are flying in for a massive closing gala right here on the front lawn tomorrow afternoon. You have lost." I watched the red taillights of Aaliyah's rented SUV bounce wildly down the gravel driveway until they disappeared into the thick Georgia night. The deputies had vanished even faster, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in their wake. Aaliyah's final threat hung in the humid air like a physical weight. Trent's billionaire investors were flying in for a closing gala. They were bringing the full crushing force of corporate real estate money to bulldoze my grandmother's legacy tomorrow afternoon. I turned the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door and walked back into the living room. Grandma Estelle was resting, her eyes closed, her breathing steady and calm for the first time in months. I pulled the fleece blanket up to her shoulders and quietly retreated down the hall to the study. The time for gathering evidence was over. Now I needed raw, aggressive firepower. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I rarely used outside of Manhattan corporate crises. The phone rang exactly twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. It was nearly midnight, but Desmond never slept. Desmond was the most ruthless, high-powered corporate litigator in Atlanta. He was a legal shark who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent contracts and burying opposing counsel under mountains of indisputable case law. "Tell me you have a body to bury, Zara," he said, his voice sharp and alert over the line. "Worse," I replied, taking a seat behind my grandfather's heavy oak desk. "I have a forged power of attorney, a chemically incapacitated matriarch, and a fraudulent deed transfer filed by a shell corporation. My father and my brother-in-law are trying to liquidate my grandmother's 500-acre estate tomorrow at a catered closing gala right here on her front lawn. I need an emergency ex parte injunction filed the second the courthouse doors open." I heard the distinct sound of Desmond shifting in his leather office chair. The sharp click of a high-end pen against mahogany echoed through the speaker. "A deed transfer is already filed," he said, his tone shifting from casual to purely analytical. "Zara breaking a notarized power of attorney and halting a commercial land sale in under 24 hours is practically impossible. Even with your medical evidence, a judge is going to look at the magnitude of this real estate deal and demand a protective injunction bond. If we halt this sale and disrupt Trent's investors, the court will require us to post cash collateral equal to the projected immediate loss of the development." "How much?" I asked, my voice dead calm. Desmond sighed, a harsh, abrasive sound. "For a 500-acre commercial golf and resort development, the judge will demand a bond of at least $5 million cash up front by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." "I am the best lawyer in this state, Zara, but I cannot manifest a financial miracle overnight. We need liquid capital." "You do not need a miracle, Desmond," I told him, pulling my encrypted laptop toward me and typing in my master authorization codes. "You just need to tell me which account to wire the funds from." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. Zara, he said cautiously, you are a senior wealth manager. You do a great job for your firm, but we are talking about $5 million in liquid cash before breakfast. I smiled, staring at the blue glow of my screen as my personal portfolio dashboard loaded. For the past decade, my entire family had treated my career like a disappointing punchline. At every Thanksgiving dinner, Jerome would loudly lament that I was nothing but a spreadsheet-pushing spinster while he poured wine paid for by toxic debt. Vivian would shake her head and tell her country club friends that it was a shame I chose a boring desk job over finding a wealthy husband like Aaliyah did. They thought I was just a glorified accountant making a modest salary in a cramped cubicle. They had absolutely no idea that I spent my days auditing the deepest financial secrets of the global elite. They did not know that I took every aggressive investment strategy, every offshore tech loophole, and every pharmaceutical market trend I uncovered, and quietly, ruthlessly applied them to my own private accounts. While Aaliyah was maxing out fraudulent credit cards to buy designer handbags, I was building an 8-figure empire. Clear the bond. Desmond, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I initiated a massive priority wire transfer from my private holding company. Liquidate the offshore tech dividends and leverage the secondary pharmaceutical trust. I am wiring $8 million to your firm's escrow account right now. Overfund the injunction bond. I want the judge to see that we are not just stalling. We are coming to completely obliterate Trent's claim to this land. I heard a sharp intake of breath over the phone. You are serious, Desmond whispered, staring at the incoming wire notification that must have just flashed across his own screen. You actually have it. I have been building an empire while they were busy playing dress-up, I told him, leaning back in my grandfather's leather chair. They think they can steamroll me because they think I am poor and powerless. They think I am just the bitter, estranged daughter standing in the way of their big payday. I want the injunction filed, stamped, and in your hand by noon. The low, rumbling sound of Desmond's laughter filled the receiver. It was a dark, predatory sound, the sound of a legal shark smelling blood in the water. Zara, he said, his voice vibrating with dangerous amusement. They have absolutely no idea who they are messing with. Have a good night. I will see you at the gala. The next evening, the golden hour's sunlight bathed the historic farm in a warm, deceitful glow. Trent and Aaliyah had spared no expense spending money they absolutely did not have. A massive white catered tent had been erected on the sprawling front lawn. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of expensive champagne and imported hors d'oeuvres. I stood inside the darkened foyer of the farmhouse, watching the grotesque display through the sheer curtains of the front window. Trent was in his element, wearing a tailored linen suit that screamed old money. He was currently standing near the edge of my grandmother's ancestral rose garden, animatedly shaking hands with 3 wealthy, older white men. These were the billionaire investors, the lifelines Trent desperately needed to save himself from federal ruin. I watched Trent gesture broadly across the property, clearly pointing out where the luxury clubhouse and the back 9 of his imaginary golf paradise would sit. It was time. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored black blazer, taking a deep breath of the air-conditioned house before reaching for the brass doorknob. Before my fingers could make contact, a hand violently shoved my shoulder, pinning me against the heavy wooden door frame. I turned to see my mother, Vivian, her face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate venom. She was wearing a silk cocktail dress, her hair perfectly coiffed, her neck dripping in pearls she had bought with Aaliyah's stolen credit. "Where do you think you are going?" Vivian hissed, her manicured fingers digging painfully into my blazer. "You are not stepping 1 foot outside this house, Zara." I looked down at her hand, then up into her panicked, furious eyes. "Let go of me, Vivian. You are going to ruin everything," she spat, her voice trembling with barely contained hysteria. "You always do this. You have always been the difficult child. You have always been jealous of your sister and your father. You are not going out there with your nappy hair and your bad attitude to scare off the money we need. Trent is closing the biggest deal of his life, and you are going to march upstairs and stay in your room until these men leave. Do you understand me?" You are nothing but a bitter, lonely girl trying to destroy your own family. I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply reached up, gripped her wrist, and peeled her hand off my jacket with enough forceful, clinical strength to make her gasp and step back. You are right about one thing, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying deadpan whisper. I am going to destroy you, but I am not doing it because I am bitter. I am doing it because you are thieves. I stepped past her, entirely unfazed by her sputtering rage. I pushed open the heavy front door and stepped out into the thick, humid Georgia evening. The immediate chatter of the gala softened slightly as I walked down the porch steps, but the jazz music kept playing. I moved with absolute undeniable purpose, walking straight past the waiters and the confused guests. Trent saw me approaching. His fake tan seemed to pale instantly. He subtly tried to shift his body to block the investors' view of me, but I was already inside the tent. I did not look at Aaliyah, who was frozen near the champagne fountain, and I did not look at Jerome, who was sweating through his suit near the catering table. I walked directly onto the small, raised wooden stage that had been set up for Trent's grand presentation. I reached out and pulled the microphone from its stand. The sudden, sharp feedback of the speakers cut through the jazz music, causing the quartet to stop playing abruptly. Silence fell over the lavish tent as every head turned toward me. Trent took a panicked step forward, his hands raised defensively. Zara, he warned through gritted teeth, his eyes wide with terror. Do not do this. I smiled a cold, predatory smile, mirroring Desmond's laugh from the night before. I looked directly past Trent, locking eyes with the three wealthy investors standing near the rose garden. Welcome to my property, gentlemen, I said, my voice booming clearly across the lawn, echoing off the century-old trees. I am Zara Washington, the legal financial guardian of this estate. I sincerely hope Trent told you about the federally protected underground aquifer you are currently standing on. Because if he did not, you are about to lose millions on a golf course you legally cannot build. The dead silence in the tent was absolute, broken only by the gentle clinking of a single champagne flute being set down on a silver tray. The three older men in expensive tailored suits turned their heads slowly from Trent to me. Their confident, relaxed smiles vanished instantly. Billionaires do not like surprises, and they particularly hate being ambushed in front of a crowd of local socialites. I stepped off the small wooden stage and walked directly toward the man in the center. He had the unmistakable aura of the lead investor, the man whose checkbook would actually fund Trent's massive hallucination. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out three thick, spiral-bound folders. I handed the first one directly to his chest, forcing him to take it. What you are holding is a certified United States Geological Survey cross-referenced with the Environmental Protection Agency, I said, keeping my voice loud enough for the entire tent to hear. My grandfather did not just leave behind 500 acres of beautiful rolling hills. He left behind the primary recharge zone for the regional limestone aquifer. The water flowing directly beneath your expensive Italian leather shoes feeds the agricultural zones for three surrounding counties. The lead investor frowned, flipping open the heavy cardstock cover. Trent lunged forward, his face flushing a deep mottled purple. Do not listen to her, Trent shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He tried to grab the folder, but the investor neatly sidestepped him, his eyes scanning the first page of the report. She is crazy. She is a disgruntled family member trying to cause a scene because she was written out of the will. I have all the municipal zoning permits. I showed you the county approvals yesterday. You showed them fabricated documents printed off a laptop in your basement, I shot back, handing the second and third folders to the other two investors, who took them with grim, cautious expressions. I pulled a matching copy for myself and held it up. Page 4, gentlemen. Notice the official federal watermarks. Building a commercial 18-hole golf course on this specific parcel of land requires moving thousands of tons of earth and pumping industrial-grade chemical fertilizers directly over a highly porous aquifer. Doing so violates exactly three federal statutes: the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act, due to a federally protected blind salamander that breeds exclusively in the underground caves beneath this farm. The second investor adjusted his glasses, tracing his manicured finger along the highlighted text on the page. The EPA specifically barred commercial development on this site in 1998. He read aloud, his voice flat and dangerous. Exactly, I said, staring unblinkingly at Trent. Which means the municipal permits Trent provided you are complete fabrications. You cannot buy this land, and even if you somehow manage to steal the deed through my father's fraudulent power of attorney, the federal government would seize the property and bury you in environmental litigation the absolute second your bulldozers broke ground. Trent looked like he was about to have a massive cardiac event. The veins in his neck were bulging, pushing against the collar of his linen suit. The slick, charismatic con artist facade melted away entirely, leaving behind a cornered, vicious animal whose trap had just snapped shut on his own leg. "You miserable, jealous liar!" Trent screamed, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You cannot stand it, can you? You cannot stand seeing someone else succeed. This is exactly why you are 35 and sleeping alone every single night. You could not keep a man if your pathetic life depended on it, so you have to destroy mine. You are nothing but a dried-up, bitter spinster who wants everyone else to be as miserable as she is." His insults meant absolutely nothing to me. They were the desperate, thrashing attacks of a drowning man. For a decade, my family had used my personal life as a shield to deflect from their own catastrophic failures. While Trent was busy playing the role of a titan of industry, using Aaliyah's stolen credit lines, I was building an 8-figure portfolio in Manhattan. While they mocked me for prioritizing my career over finding a husband, I was learning exactly how to financially disembowel men exactly like him. I did not flinch. I just stared at him with cold, clinical disgust. Aaliyah broke through the crowd, her high heels sinking into the soft grass. Her face was a mask of pure, unhinged fury. She rushed straight at the lead investor, her hands flying out as she violently slapped the geological survey right out of his grip. The heavy folder hit the ground with a loud thud, official federal pages scattering across the manicured lawn. "Stop reading that garbage!" Aaliyah shrieked, her voice echoing wildly through the silent tent. "She is insane. She just wants attention because Daddy never loved her as much as me. She's making all of this up to extort us for money. Trent is a visionary. He is going to make you richer than you already are. Just sign the contracts and ignore this jealous bitch." The lead investor looked down at the scattered pages near his shoes, then slowly looked up at Aaliyah. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted his platinum cufflinks and leveled a glare at Trent that could have frozen boiling water. The sheer disdain in his eyes was absolute. Billionaires do not tolerate public humiliation, and they certainly do not tolerate hysterical women slapping financial documents out of their hands. The investor bent down, moving with deliberate, terrifying calmness, and picked up a single page from the grass. It was the page bearing the official embossed seal of the Environmental Protection Agency. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. "I have been in commercial real estate for 40 years. The lead investor said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "I know a federal watermark when I see one." He crumpled the paper in his fist and threw it directly at Trent's chest. "If this is true and you brought us down here on fabricated municipal permits to solicit investment capital across state lines, this is wire fraud." Trent opened his mouth, gasping for air, but no words came out. "We are done here," the investor said, turning his back on Trent entirely. He looked at his two associates. "Let us go. I am calling our legal team from the jet." The three men turned and marched out of the tent without another word, cutting a swift path across the lawn toward their waiting black car service. Aaliyah let out a breathless, horrified gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as she watched her shiny, luxurious future walk out the door forever. The remaining guests stood in stunned silence. The catering staff froze, holding trays of melting appetizers. The jazz quartet stood completely motionless behind their brass instruments. Trent watched the taillights of the black car disappear down the driveway. His entire body was shaking. He slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto Jerome, who was cowering near the edge of the tent, looking like a man who was about to face a firing squad. Trent did not care about the guests anymore. He did not care about appearances. He lunged toward my father, grabbing Jerome by the lapels of his suit and shaking him violently. "Get the judge on the phone now!" Trent screamed, his voice tearing raw and desperate from his throat. "Force the eviction!" Jerome shoved Trent backward violently, breaking his son-in-law's desperate grip. The remaining gala guests were already whispering, inching toward the valet station in a chaotic, murmuring exodus. Jerome's face was a mottled mask of humiliation and fury. He violently adjusted his suit jacket, his chest heaving, and locked his eyes on me. The veneer of the successful, untouchable Atlanta businessman was entirely gone, replaced by the vicious, cornered man I had uncovered in my financial autopsy. Jerome marched across the grass, grabbed my upper arm with a bruising, unforgiving grip, and yanked me toward the farmhouse. Vivian followed closely behind her high heels, stabbing aggressively into the soft dirt. They shoved me through the heavy oak front door into the dimly lit foyer, slamming it shut behind us to block out the stares of the caterers and the retreating guests. Aaliyah stayed outside, desperately trying to console a hyperventilating Trent, who was currently watching his billionaire lifelines speed down the county road. "You think you have won!" Jerome snarled, backing me against the hallway wall with terrifying intensity. "You think waving a few federal papers around changes anything. You have no idea how the real world operates, Zara. I have spent the last 30 years building a network. I play golf with the county judges. I fund the local sheriff's re-election campaigns. I can make one phone call right now and have you thrown in a holding cell for corporate espionage, theft of proprietary documents, and trespassing. They will lose the key, and by the time your fancy Manhattan lawyers figure out what happened, this farm will be completely bulldozed." I looked at his red, sweating face. I looked at Vivian standing beside him with her arms crossed, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. If I fought them right now, if I pushed back with more legal threats, or matched their screaming, they might panic. They might flee the state before the trap completely snapped shut. I needed them to stay exactly where they were. I needed them to feel victorious, invincible, and entirely safe in their own delusions. So I audited their psychology, and I gave them exactly what they needed to see. I let the fire completely die out of my eyes. I physically dropped my shoulders, allowing my posture to slump against the vintage floral wallpaper. I let out a long, ragged sigh, dropping my gaze to the scuffed hardwood floor. I made myself look utterly exhausted, like a woman who had played her final desperate card and realized it simply was not enough to beat the house. Vivian let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. Her posture immediately straightened, sensing blood in the water. "You always were a quitter, Zara." Vivian gloated, stepping closer to inspect my meticulously crafted defeat. "Whenever things got too difficult, you just folded. It was the same when you quit piano, the same when you gave up on finding a decent husband, and it is the exact same now. You thought you could march down here with your little spreadsheets and outsmart your father. But you are just a lonely, bitter girl who plays with numbers while the adults handle the real business. Just pack your bags and go back to your empty, sterile apartment in New York. You do not belong here. You never did." I did not argue. I kept my head down, offering a single defeated nod that seemed to fill my parents with immense toxic satisfaction. I turned away from them and slowly walked up the grand wooden staircase. Every heavy step I took felt like a concession, a public surrender to their dominance. I walked into the guest bedroom where I had been staying. I did not need to gather my things. My single black canvas duffel bag was already zipped and waiting on the bed. I grabbed the heavy nylon handles, threw the strap over my shoulder, and walked back downstairs. Jerome and Vivian were already in the kitchen pouring themselves glasses of my grandfather's expensive bourbon, loudly discussing how quickly they could get a local judge to invalidate my environmental survey. They did not even look up as I walked down the hall. I pushed open the heavy wooden back door, stepped off the rear porch, and walked out into the cool, dark expanse of the farm. I did not walk toward my rented Escalade parked in the main driveway. I turned away from the house entirely, cutting through the dense, shadowed rows of the pecan grove. The sounds of Trent's ruined gala faded behind me, replaced by the chirping of crickets and the rhythmic crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. I walked for half a mile down an unpaved, forgotten dirt road that ran along the southern property line, navigating by the pale light of the moon. Waiting in the pitch-black shadows beneath a massive weeping willow was a heavily tinted black SUV. The engine was silently idling, the headlights completely dark. As I approached, the rear passenger door swung open with a quiet mechanical click. I climbed inside, tossing my duffel bag onto the plush floorboard. The interior smelled of expensive leather and fresh black coffee. Desmond was sitting in the driver's seat, his broad shoulders filling out a pristine charcoal suit. The ambient glow from the dashboard illuminated his sharp features and the thick manila folder resting squarely on the center console. Desmond looked at me through the rearview mirror, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Did they take the bait?" he asked. "Hook, line, and sinker," I replied, pulling the heavy armored door of the SUV shut. The ambient lights dimmed, plunging the cabin back into secure, tinted darkness. "They are absolutely frantic. Trent is practically vibrating with panic, and Jerome is fully convinced he just bullied me into total submission. They are planning to fast-track an emergency eviction hearing the second the courthouse opens tomorrow morning." A soft, elegant chuckle floated from the back seat. I turned around. Grandma Estelle was sitting in the plush leather captain's chair directly behind Desmond. She was completely unrecognizable from the frail, vacant woman I had tucked under a fleece blanket just an hour ago. She was sitting bolt upright, dressed in a sharp, tailored navy pantsuit, her silver hair perfectly pinned back into an immaculate twist. She unscrewed the cap of a stainless steel thermos, taking a slow, deliberate sip of iced sweet tea. Her dark eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely lucid. While I had been standing in the foyer letting Vivian scream in my face and playing the part of the defeated daughter, Desmond had quietly slipped through the rear utility door of the farmhouse. He had walked straight into the study, offered his arm to my grandmother, and escorted her out to the waiting vehicle. She had not swallowed a single one of the psychiatric sedatives Vivian had been forcing on her all week. She had been spitting them into a tissue, playing the part of an incapacitated, confused elder with Oscar-winning precision, waiting for exactly this moment. Desmond clicked on the overhead reading light. He flipped open the thick manila folder resting on the center console. The crisp, heavy stock paper inside bore the unmistakable embossed watermark of the state of Georgia, stamped and sealed by a master notary just 48 hours prior. It was the absolute, irrevocable, and completely legitimate power of attorney. Right beneath it lay the ironclad family trust documents, transferring full legal and operational control of the entire 500-acre estate directly to me. "We have the authentic paperwork right here," Desmond said, tapping a heavy gold pen against the signatures. "I have the medical records proving her cognitive function is flawless. I have the toxicology screen request proving they were attempting to poison her. We could have dropped this on the dining room table tonight, Zara. We could have called the local sheriff, showed them these trust documents, and had Trent and Jerome thrown off the property for trespassing right in the middle of their jazz gala. Why put yourself through that performance inside the house? Why let them think they won?" "Because if I stopped them tonight, they would just slink away and try another scam," I explained, leaning forward to look at the paperwork. "I know how my father operates. I know how Trent maneuvers. If I showed my hand inside that farmhouse, they would have instantly played the victims. Jerome would have blamed a rogue paralegal for the forged deed. Trent would have claimed he was just trying to help manage a complicated estate. They would have hired a dozen slick defense attorneys and spent the next 5 years draining my grandmother's actual accounts through endless, exhausting civil litigation. They would have hovered around this property, like vultures waiting for another moment of weakness to strike again. I do not want a temporary victory, Desmond. I want a permanent solution. I want them completely neutralized." Desmond leaned back against the leather headrest, his eyes fixed on me. "Go on." "Trent is desperate," I continued, my voice cold and clinical. "His billionaire investors just walked out on him because I handed them the geological survey. He knows his luxury golf course is dead in the water, but he is too arrogant and too deep in toxic debt to accept defeat. He thinks if he can secure a court-ordered eviction by tomorrow morning and legally remove me from the premises, he can somehow salvage the deal. He is going to walk into a county courthouse. He is going to stand before a sitting judge. He is going to willingly present a medically fabricated cognitive evaluation, a forged deed transfer, and a completely fraudulent power of attorney. Desmond caught on immediately, a wicked razor-sharp smile spreading across his face. And the absolute second he submits those forged documents to the court clerk to force your eviction, he crosses the line from a messy civil family dispute into severe, indisputable criminal territory. Exactly, I said. By letting them take those documents to the courthouse tomorrow, they are willingly committing multiple federal felonies on the public record. They are committing perjury, real estate fraud, and attempted extortion directly in front of a judge. They are handing us the exact weapon we need to put them in a federal penitentiary. They thought I was retreating because I was weak. They have no idea I was just clearing the blast radius. The quiet hum of the SUV's engine filled the silence as the sheer magnitude of the trap settled over the cabin. We were not just protecting the farm anymore. We were orchestrating a massive, inescapable legal ambush. My father and my brother-in-law were walking blindly into a concrete cell, driven entirely by their own unchecked greed and their absolute refusal to view me as a legitimate threat. Grandma Estelle lowered her thermos. She turned her head slowly, looking out the tinted window at the sprawling historic farmhouse illuminated by the moonlight. She looked at the wide wraparound porch, the towering oak trees, and the vast fertile land she had built from nothing alongside her late husband. She had watched her own son try to drug her, steal her legacy, and sell her history to the highest bidder just to fund a shallow, luxurious lifestyle. There was no sadness left in her eyes, only a profound, immovable strength. "Let them dig the hole, baby," Estelle told me, her voice ringing with absolute regal authority in the quiet vehicle. "We will just hand them the shovels." The morning sun baked the concrete steps of the Fulton County Courthouse. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere was thick with manufactured grief and staggering arrogance. Trent, Aaliyah, Jerome, and Vivian occupied the front row of the plaintiffs' benches like royalty holding court. They were dressed in coordinated designer mourning attire, radiating a smug, bulletproof entitlement. Vivian wore a black silk dress with a matching fascinator, while Aaliyah periodically dabbed at her perfectly contoured cheeks with a lace handkerchief. Trent sat with his legs crossed casually, checking his gold Rolex, confident that his local connections were about to hand him the keys to a 500-acre kingdom. Trent had hired a sleazy local attorney named Barnes, a man known for pushing through questionable paperwork for wealthy developers. Barnes stood before Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense magistrate, who looked visibly irritated by the emergency morning docket. Barnes dramatically slapped the forged power of attorney onto the wooden podium. "Your Honor," Barnes proclaimed, his voice echoing through the mostly empty courtroom, "we are asking for an immediate emergency order of eviction against Zara Washington and a temporary medical conservatorship over Estelle Washington. The matriarch of this family is suffering from severe advanced dementia. She is a danger to herself. Furthermore, her estranged granddaughter Zara has barricaded herself in the family estate and is actively exploiting an incapacitated senior citizen to derail a vital commercial land sale. We need law enforcement to clear the property today." Judge Harrison frowned, adjusting her glasses as she peered at the documents. "These are incredibly serious allegations, Counselor. You are asking me to strip a woman of her legal autonomy and send sheriff's deputies to force a relative off private property. We have sworn testimony." "Your Honor," Barnes replied, gesturing toward the witness stand. "The woman's own son is prepared to speak to her tragic mental decline." Jerome stood up, smoothing his tailored suit jacket, and walked to the stand with his head bowed. He placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. What followed was a sickening masterclass in manipulation. Jerome squeezed his eyes shut, forcing a single fake tear to roll down his cheek. His voice trembled with theatrical heartbreak. "It absolutely breaks my heart to do this, Your Honor," Jerome said, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "My mother was a brilliant, strong woman, but her mind is completely gone. She does not know what year it is. She does not recognize her own children. We have been trying to manage her care quietly to preserve her dignity, but my troubled daughter Zara has taken advantage of the situation. Zara has always been jealous, resentful, and emotionally unstable. She is holding my mother hostage in that house, filling her confused head with paranoid delusions just to spite our family. We just want to get my mother into a secure psychiatric facility where she can be safe. Vivian sniffled loudly from the front row, patting Jerome's shoulder as he stepped down from the stand. Trent leaned back, shooting a triumphant, sneering glance at the heavy double doors at the back of the room. He thought he had completely won. He thought the gavel was about to come down and hand him my grandmother's entire legacy. Then the courtroom doors swung open with a massive, deafening bang. The heavy oak slammed against the back wall, causing the bailiff to jump and Judge Harrison to snap her head up. I walked straight down the center aisle wearing an immaculate tailored burgundy suit. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, echoing like gunshots in the sudden dead silence. I did not look at Trent or Aaliyah. I kept my eyes locked directly on the judge. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying clear and absolute authority across the room. "But the defense has a witness." Right behind me, the doorway filled with a presence that instantly sucked the air out of the room. Grandma Estelle walked into the Fulton County Courthouse. She was not in a wheelchair. She was not shuffling. She was not sedated or confused. She was walking tall, her spine straight as a steel rod, dressed in a stunning tailored navy pantsuit that commanded absolute respect. She wore her favorite pearl necklace, and her sharp dark eyes scanned the room with the lethal, calculating focus of a matriarch who was about to burn her ungrateful children to the ground. Desmond walked beside her, his hand lightly resting near her elbow, ready to offer support if she needed it, but she moved entirely under her own power. He carried the thick manila folder holding the authentic legal documents like a loaded weapon. In the front row, Vivian let out a strangled, horrifying gasp. Her fingers went completely slack and her expensive Prada clutch slipped from her hands, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud clatter. Her jaw hung open, her face draining of all color. Jerome looked as if he had just seen a ghost, his knees visibly buckling as he grabbed the back of the wooden bench to keep from collapsing. Trent's fake tan turned a sickly shade of gray, his confident smirk vanishing into an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. Aaliyah panicked. Her survival instincts kicked in, and she desperately tried to salvage the shattered narrative. She leaped up from the bench, abandoning her lace handkerchief, and rushed toward the aisle, holding her hands out in a gesture of exaggerated, frantic concern. Grandma Aaliyah cried out, her voice shrill and trembling. "Grandma, you are confused. You wandered out of the house. Please come sit down before you hurt yourself. You do not know where you are." Estelle stopped walking. She turned her head slowly and looked Aaliyah up and down. Her gaze was so intense, so piercingly lucid, that Aaliyah physically stopped in her tracks, unable to take another step forward. "The only thing I am confused about, Aaliyah," Estelle said, her voice ringing out crisp, clear, and dripping with absolute disdain, "is why you are wearing a $5,000 Chanel suit while your credit cards are 90 days past due." The courtroom fell so silent you could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents. Aaliyah's mouth snapped shut, her face flushing a deep, humiliating crimson as she shrank back toward her mother. The sleazy attorney Barnes looked down at his forged papers and then up at the very alert, very angry woman he had just tried to have committed. He took a slow, terrified step away from the podium. Desmond did not miss a beat. He stepped smoothly past me and walked directly to the defense table, sliding his custom briefcase onto the wood. He buttoned his suit jacket and turned his dark, predatory gaze up to Judge Harrison, who was staring wide-eyed at my grandmother. "Your Honor," Desmond said, his voice smooth, rich, and terrifyingly calm. "My name is Desmond Sterling, representing Estelle Washington and Zara Washington. I am here to inform the court that not only is the power of attorney presented by the plaintiffs a complete and total forgery, but my client is entirely of sound mind. Furthermore, we are not just requesting a dismissal of this fraudulent eviction attempt. We have video evidence to submit to the record right now." Desmond did not wait for the defense attorney to object. He smoothly unclasped his custom leather briefcase, withdrew a small silver flash drive, and plugged it directly into the courtroom's secure media terminal. The four large flat-screen monitors mounted on the wood-paneled walls flickered to life simultaneously. What you are about to see. Your Honor is subpoenaed security footage from Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Desmond stated, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. The timestamp places this event exactly 3 weeks ago, less than 48 hours before the plaintiffs filed their fraudulent medical evaluation with this court. The grainy high-definition video began to play. The camera angle provided a wide, unobstructed view of Terminal E. The courtroom sat in absolute breathless silence as Jerome and Vivian appeared on the screens. They were flanking Grandma Estelle, gripping her arms with forceful, aggressive impatience. Estelle looked unsteady, clearly fighting the heavy dose of unauthorized psychiatric sedatives Vivian had been slipping into her morning tea. Jerome practically dragged his own mother toward a bank of metal seating near a large trash receptacle. Vivian pointed a sharp, manicured finger directly at Estelle's face, her mouth moving in rapid, angry syllables that required no audio to interpret. Then, with terrifying casualness, Jerome checked his gold watch. He grabbed Vivian's elbow, turned his back on the woman who had given him life and power, walked away. The camera tracked them seamlessly as they bypassed the boarding gates entirely and disappeared through the frosted glass doors of the Delta Sky Club first-class lounge. Grandma Estelle was left sitting completely alone next to a garbage can in the busiest airport in the world. A collective horrified gasp echoed through the courtroom. The bailiff shifted his weight, his hand dropping instinctively toward his heavy leather utility belt. Vivian let out a pathetic, suffocated whimper, sinking so low in her seat she practically disappeared behind the wooden partition. Jerome was sweating so profusely that dark, wet patches bloomed rapidly across the shoulders of his expensive suit. "This is an outrage!" Trent suddenly screamed, leaping up from the plaintiff's table so violently his heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the floor. He slammed his fists onto the table, spittle flying from his lips. "You cannot show this in here. This is a gross violation of privacy. Objection! Barnes, do your job and object to this blatant character assassination." Barnes, the sleazy local attorney, who had been so arrogant just 10 minutes prior, remained completely frozen in his seat. He stared at the high-definition monitors, his face entirely drained of blood. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at a slam-dunk elder abuse and kidnapping conviction, and he wanted absolutely no part of the federal fallout. "Sit down and be quiet, Trent," I said, my voice slicing through his panic like a scalpel. "You are not running a country club presentation anymore. You are in a federal trap and the jaws just snapped shut." Desmond tapped a single key on his laptop. The airport security footage vanished from the monitors, instantly replaced by a high-resolution scan of a certified banking ledger. The official seal of the farm's primary agricultural credit union glowed brightly in the top right corner. The rows of numbers were highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow. If the court is wondering why a wealthy, supposedly concerned son would abandon his allegedly incapacitated mother near an airport trash can, we have the answer right here, Desmond continued, stepping away from the podium and gesturing broadly toward the screens. This is the official operating account for the Washington family estate. For 40 years, this account has been strictly used for payroll, equipment maintenance, and agricultural taxes. But the very next morning, less than 12 hours after dumping Estelle like unwanted luggage, Jerome Washington utilized the forged power of attorney to authorize a massive wire transfer. He drained $200,000 of liquid farm operating cash. Desmond tapped another key, bringing up the receiving account's routing details alongside the bank statement. "And where did that $200,000 go?" Desmond asked rhetorically, his voice echoing with lethal precision. "It was wired directly into a corporate shell account owned entirely by Trent. A shell account that, according to our forensic audit, was operating at a massive, catastrophic deficit. Trent was facing imminent corporate bankruptcy. He could not secure legitimate development permits because building a golf course on that land violates the Clean Water Act. His billionaire investors were getting anxious and demanding proof of capital. He needed a massive injection of liquid cash to keep his shell company afloat just long enough to finalize the fraudulent sale. So Jerome decided to fund his son-in-law's real estate scam by literally robbing his own mother the second he got her out of the state. The math was simple, brutal, and entirely undeniable. Trent looked wildly around the room, his chest heaving with panicked, shallow breaths. He looked at Barnes, who was actively scooting his chair further away from the table. He looked at Aaliyah, who was staring at the bank ledgers on the screen with a look of pure, unadulterated terror. The illusion of their wealthy, untouchable lifestyle was completely gone, instantly replaced by the terrifying concrete reality of federal prison. "You set us up," Trent stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You planned this whole thing. You let us walk in here." "I told you last night, Trent," I replied, my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. "I told you that you were standing on a protected aquifer. I told you that your permits were fake. You chose to walk into this courthouse today. You chose to present forged legal documents to a sitting judge. I did not set you up. I just let you operate exactly the way you always do." Judge Harrison had been completely silent throughout the entire presentation, her eyes darting between the monitors, the forged documents sitting on her desk, and the four panicked people trembling in the front row. Her face had slowly transitioned from judicial irritation to a deep, vibrant shade of furious crimson. The veins in her neck stood out in sharp relief. She gripped the handle of her wooden gavel with white knuckles. Judge Harrison stood up, towering over her elevated bench. She slammed her gavel down onto the sounding block. The impact was so violently forceful that the sharp, explosive crack echoed off the high vaulted ceilings like a gunshot. "Nobody moves a single muscle in this courtroom," Judge Harrison snarled, her voice vibrating with absolute, terrifying rage. Judge Harrison glared down from the elevated bench, her chest heaving as the echo of the wooden gavel faded into the heavy, suffocating silence of the courtroom. The air was entirely, completely still, thick with the sudden, terrifying realization that the balance of power had violently shifted. She extended a trembling hand toward Desmond, her eyes narrowing with absolute judicial fury. She ordered him to bring the authentic documents forward immediately. Desmond moved with smooth, practiced efficiency. He walked to the bench, handing over the heavy manila folder containing the legitimate power of attorney, the authentic family trust transfer, and the comprehensive medical evaluations proving my grandmother was entirely sound of mind. The judge put on her reading glasses. She spent 5 agonizing minutes reviewing the paperwork, comparing the state seals, inspecting the notary stamps, and cross-referencing the dates with the fraudulent garbage Barnes had submitted moments earlier. The longer she read, the darker her expression became. You could practically hear the collective heartbeat of my family racing out of control. Trent was visibly hyperventilating, his hands gripping the edge of the defendant table so tightly his knuckles were stark white. Vivian was paralyzed, staring straight ahead with wide, unblinking eyes, trapped in a nightmare she could not buy her way out of. Jerome could not handle the silence. His ego simply would not allow him to sit there and wait for the axe to fall. He stood up violently, shrugging off Vivian's desperate attempt to pull him back down by his jacket sleeve. He stepped toward the center aisle, raising his hands in a placating, deeply arrogant gesture. He was defaulting to the only defense mechanism he knew. He was trying to charm the room. "Your Honor." Jerome began, his voice dripping with forced, respectful humility. "I believe there has been a massive, tragic misunderstanding here today. I am a respectable Black businessman in the city of Atlanta. I have spent my entire life building generational wealth, creating opportunities, and establishing a pristine reputation in this community. I love my mother. We were simply trying to navigate a highly complex, emotionally devastating family medical crisis. My daughter Zara is deeply troubled. She has clearly manipulated my mother into signing documents she does not understand. I implore you to look at my record, look at my standing in the community, and see that my intentions were purely to protect my family legacy." Judge Harrison lowered the authentic trust documents slowly. She took off her glasses, placing them deliberately on the wooden bench. When she looked down at Jerome, her eyes held the kind of profound, absolute disgust usually reserved for violent predators. "Do not you dare stand in my courtroom and invoke the legacy of Black wealth to justify your staggering, reprehensible greed," Judge Harrison said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that carried to every corner of the room. Do not you dare weaponize your community while standing over the metaphorical body of your own mother. Jerome opened his mouth to argue, but the judge raised a single hand, silencing him instantly. For generations, families in our community have had their land stolen from them. Judge Harrison continued her words, cutting through Jerome like a serrated blade. They had their acreage stripped away through predatory lending, forged deeds, and backroom legal manipulations orchestrated by outsiders. And here you are, a man blessed with an inheritance of fertile debt, free land, employing those exact same predatory tactics against the woman who gave you life. You did not just try to steal a farm today, Mr. Washington. You set back your community's legacy of land ownership by 50 years out of pure, unadulterated selfish greed. Jerome physically recoiled, stepping back as if he had been struck across the face. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. The polished, untouchable facade was entirely shattered. The court has reviewed the evidence presented by Mr. Sterling. The judge announced, her voice returning to a booming official cadence. I am officially validating the authentic power of attorney and the historic family trust transfer, granting Zara Washington full legal and operational control of the Washington estate. I am rejecting the plaintiff's entire case. I am dismissing the fraudulent medical evaluation, the baseless eviction request, and the horrific attempt at establishing a conservatorship. The actions presented by the plaintiffs today constitute egregious elder abuse, a profound fraud upon the court, and blatant malicious forgery. Trent let out a strangled, pathetic noise, dropping his head onto the wooden table. Barnes, the sleazy local attorney, was already quietly snapping his briefcase shut, keeping his head down and moving toward the side exit. He knew his career was over, and he was leaving his clients completely undefended. Judge Harrison turned her furious gaze toward the armed officer standing near the jury box. Bailiff, contact the district attorney's office. I am ordering the immediate detainment of Jerome and Trent for felony fraud and perjury. The courtroom erupted into absolute visceral chaos. Two heavy-set bailiffs immediately moved down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the marble floor. They bypassed me entirely, marching straight toward the plaintiff's table. Trent shrieked as the first officer grabbed his shoulder, violently yanking him out of his chair. Trent tried to pull away, crying out that he was a victim, that Jerome had forced him into it, that he was bankrupt and desperate. His whining echoed off the high walls as the officer twisted his arms behind his back. The heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping onto Trent's wrists sounded like a vault door slamming shut forever. Jerome did not fight. He stood completely rigid, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blankly at the judge as the second bailiff secured his hands behind his back. The untouchable Atlanta businessman was reduced to a common criminal in front of his entire family. Vivian completely broke. The arrogant, icy matriarch who had spent my entire life telling me I was worthless suddenly collapsed into hysterical, genuine tears. Her perfect posture disintegrated. She scrambled out of the wooden bench, her designer heels slipping on the floor, and ran directly toward me. She completely ignored her husband standing in handcuffs. She threw herself at my feet, grabbing my suit jacket with both hands, her perfectly manicured nails digging desperately into the expensive burgundy fabric. Zara. Please, Vivian, sobbed, her face smeared with mascara and tears. We are your family. Pay their bail, you have the money. You control the trust now. Do not do this to us. Please, Zara, I am begging you. I looked down at the woman who had tormented me for 3 decades. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel anger or triumph. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute closure. I reached down, grasped her wrists, and gently but firmly peeled her trembling fingers off my suit jacket, stepping back to break the physical contact entirely. Family does not leave their mother at gate 24 with a one-way ticket to a state facility, Vivian. I said, my voice cold, even, and entirely devoid of mercy. Vivian let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying her face in her hands as she collapsed against the edge of the wooden bench. Grandma Estelle stood beside me, leaning slightly on Desmond's arm, watching her daughter-in-law unravel with a look of absolute icy satisfaction. Aaliyah was left standing entirely alone near the center aisle. The golden child mask had completely shattered. She was staring at her husband, who was currently weeping as the bailiff hauled him toward the holding cells. She looked at her father being marched out in disgrace. She looked at her mother sobbing on the floor. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the expensive dinners, and the endless stream of fabricated wealth were all gone. She was a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, suddenly stripped of every single financial safety net she had ever relied upon. Aaliyah turned her head slowly, her tear-streaked face locking onto mine. Her eyes were wide, terrified, and completely hollow. She looked at the tailored suit I was wearing, she looked at the grandmother she had tried to discard, and she looked at the undeniable reality of her completely ruined life. Her voice shook, cracking under the weight of total inescapable panic. "What am I supposed to do now?" Aliyah's voice cracked high and brittle, echoing in the cavernous space of courtroom 4B. The two bailiffs had just cleared the heavy wooden doors with Trent and Jerome in tow, leaving a stunned, breathless vacuum in their wake. Vivian was still slumped against the wooden bench, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders heaving with ragged, uncontrollable sobs. Aaliyah took a tentative step toward me, her designer heels scuffing awkwardly against the polished marble. The golden child mask had not just slipped. It had been violently ripped away, exposing the terrified, utterly dependent woman underneath. Aaliyah began to babble, the words tumbling out in a frantic, uncoordinated rush. She closed the distance between us, her hands reaching out as if she wanted to grab my arm, though she wisely stopped just inches away, when Desmond smoothly shifted his weight, placing himself slightly between us as a silent warning. "Zara, you have to help me." Aaliyah pleaded, hot tears carving tracks through her expensive foundation. "Trent's accounts are entirely frozen. I heard the judge. They are going to seize everything. Our massive estate in Buckhead has a $20,000 monthly mortgage, and we are already 2 months behind. Trent used our joint accounts as collateral for his business loans. My car lease is tied to that shell company. I do not have a single dollar to my name that is not connected to his fraud." She wrung her hands together, her diamond rings flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. "You control the trust now," she cried, her voice escalating into a desperate, high-pitched whine. "The farm generates millions in revenue. You can just write a check. Just a small loan to keep the house until this all blows over. I do not know how to survive out there. I do not know how to work a real job. Trent handled all the money. I have never even paid a utility bill. You cannot just leave me with nothing. We are sisters, Zara." I looked at my older sister. I looked at her perfectly manicured hands, which had never known a single day of actual labor. I looked at the $5,000 Chanel suit she was wearing, purchased with money bled from my grandmother's legacy. I remembered a blazing hot summer exactly 10 years ago. I had been working double shifts at a miserable, grease-stained local diner to pay for my environmental science textbooks because Jerome flatly refused to fund a degree that did not directly benefit his corporate real estate interests. Aaliyah had strolled into my section with 4 of her sorority friends. They had occupied my largest booth for 3 hours during the lunch rush. She had run me ragged, demanding extra lemons, sending back perfectly cooked food, and loudly complaining about the slow service. When they finally left, she left a $0 tip on a $100 bill. When I confronted her later that night at the family house, exhausted and smelling of fryer grease, she had laughed right in my face. She had propped her feet up on our mother's pristine glass coffee table, sipped a mimosa, and told me that working a humiliating minimum wage job was exactly what I deserved for being so stubborn. She told me the struggle was good for me. She told me the humiliation of serving her friends was character building. I stepped forward, moving deliberately past Aaliyah, toward the heavy oak plaintiff's table. I reached into my slim leather portfolio, retrieved a single crisp piece of paper, and placed it flat against the polished wood. I slid it slowly across the table until it stopped right in front of her trembling hands. Aaliyah looked down. Her tear-filled eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page. It was a standard entry-level employment application for a night shift cashier position at a local 24-hour big-box retailer. The starting wage was printed clearly in the upper right corner. $15 an hour. "What is this?" Aaliyah whispered, her voice barely registering above a breath, as she stared at the application in absolute horror. "It is your new reality," I stated, my tone devoid of any sympathy, anger, or malice. It was simply a cold, hard fact. You just admitted you have no marketable skills, no work history, and no concept of financial independence. You have spent 30 years acting like a parasite, feeding off a legacy you did absolutely nothing to build. You mocked me when I worked double shifts to pay for my own education. You stood by and cheered while Trent and Jerome plotted to drug your own grandmother just to fund your luxury lifestyle. You do not get a bailout, Aaliyah. You do not get a check from the trust. Aaliyah shook her head, backing away from the table as if the piece of paper were a venomous snake preparing to strike. "I cannot work a cash register. I am a Washington. People know me. I have a reputation in this city." "You had a reputation," I corrected her sharply. "By tomorrow morning, your reputation will be front-page news across Atlanta. Everyone you know at the country club, everyone you shop with in Buckhead, everyone you try to impress at your charity galas, they will all know exactly how your husband financed your life. They will know you are entirely broke." I pointed a single unwavering finger at the application resting on the table. "Fill it out, Aaliyah. Wear comfortable shoes. Learn how to stand on your feet for 8 hours a night scanning groceries. Consider it character building." The absolute horror on her face was the final definitive conclusion to a lifetime of abuse. There were no more arguments to make. There were no more legal maneuvers to execute. The war was over, and the empire they had tried to steal, the legacy they had tried to pave over, was now permanently legally protected. I turned away from the plaintiff's table, leaving Aaliyah staring blankly at the application. Desmond was already standing beside Grandma Estelle, a quiet, respectful guardian. I walked over to the matriarch of our family. Estelle looked up at me, her dark eyes shining with a profound, immovable pride. She did not look back at Vivian, who was still weeping pathetically on the floor. She did not look at Aaliyah, who was paralyzed by the terrifying reality of minimum wage. I offered my arm. Estelle reached out her hand, wrapping firmly around my elbow. We linked arms, standing shoulder to shoulder, a united, unbreakable front. Desmond opened the small wooden gate separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. We walked together down the center aisle. We did not rush. We took our time, our footsteps echoing in perfect synchronized rhythm across the marble floor. We left the ruined remnants of a toxic, greedy family behind us in the wreckage of their own making. Desmond held the heavy oak doors open for us. We stepped out into the bright, warm morning light of the courthouse rotunda. Desmond followed right behind us, releasing the heavy brass handles. The massive oak doors swung shut, sealing courtroom 4B with a loud, incredibly satisfying thud. The sharp crack of Judge Harrison's gavel was not an ending. It was the starting pistol for a rapid, systematic dismantling of an empire built entirely on lies. The true devastation unfolded in the quiet, methodical weeks that followed the courtroom confrontation. Trent's downfall was swift, absolute, and entirely devoid of mercy. The IRS, alerted to the sudden massive discrepancies in his corporate filings, descended upon his shell companies with lethal precision. Federal agents raided his leased luxury office space in downtown Atlanta, hauling out dozens of cardboard boxes, packed with falsified ledgers, forged environmental permits, and years of blatant tax evasion evidence. His accounts were seized before he even made bail. His billionaire investors, terrified of federal subpoenas, immediately severed all ties, leaving Trent legally and financially abandoned to face a mountain of federal indictments entirely alone. For Aaliyah, the descent into reality was a brutal physical shock to her system. The $20,000 a month Buckhead estate received its foreclosure notice within 14 days. With her joint accounts frozen and her credit utterly destroyed by Trent's fraudulent collateral loans, she was forced to pack whatever designer clothes she could fit into her leased SUV before the repo men arrived to take that too. The scanner beeped in a harsh, monotonous rhythm. Aaliyah Washington stared blankly at the conveyor belt, her hands encased in cheap rubber gloves to protect her ruined, chipped manicures. She wore a stiff royal blue polyester vest with a plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her chest. It was 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. The big box retailer smelled aggressively of industrial floor wax and stale popcorn. A customer shoved a heavy cart full of discount laundry detergent and bulk dog food toward her register. Aaliyah reached for the heavy plastic jugs, her shoulders aching violently, her feet throbbing inside sensible non-slip black shoes. She was currently renting a cramped single-bedroom apartment above a noisy commercial laundromat. During her first week on the job, a former sorority sister from the country club had walked through her checkout lane. Aaliyah had kept her head down, her face burning with a humiliation so profound it made her physically nauseous, silently scanning barcodes while her former friend pretended not to recognize her. $15 an hour. Character building. But Jerome and Vivian faced a much steeper, far more terrifying cliff. The federal charges for elder abuse, kidnapping, and fraud upon the court carried mandatory minimum sentences that stretched into decades. Jerome had arrogantly assumed he could simply hire the most aggressive, expensive criminal defense team in the state of Georgia to bully the prosecutors into a settlement. He was devastatingly wrong. As the legally recognized, undisputed head of the Washington Trust, Zara had immediately initiated a comprehensive, ruthless forensic financial audit. She utilized the full weight of the authentic trust documents to legally freeze every single bank account, investment portfolio, and liquid asset that had been illegally commingled with the farm's stolen revenue. Jerome and Vivian were instantly securely locked out of their own fabricated wealth. The untouchable, highly respected Atlanta businessman was forced to sit in a bleak cinderblock holding room across from a chronically overworked, exhausted public defender who had 30 other active felony cases to review that afternoon. Vivian, stripped of her platinum credit cards and her socialite status, was forced to quietly pawn her remaining unseized tennis bracelets just to afford a temporary roach-infested motel room near the Fulton County Courthouse. The illusion of their superiority had been entirely evaporated by the very legal system they had tried to manipulate. Zara sat at her kitchen island, the morning sunlight streaming through the large windows, illuminating the pristine, organized stacks of farm operating ledgers spread across the marble counter. The silence of her home was broken by the sharp ringing of her cell phone. She glanced at the screen. The caller ID simply read, Fulton County Correctional Facility. She accepted the call, placing the phone flat on the counter and pressing the speaker button. The automated voice was sterile and robotic. "You have a collect call from an inmate. Do you accept the charges?" "Yes," Zara said evenly. "Zara, listen to me," Jerome rasped, his voice echoing thinly through the harsh metallic connection. "You need to stop this audit immediately. You need to unfreeze the accounts. I cannot sit in this concrete box. You are destroying your own blood. We are your family. I am your father. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your clothes. I gave you life, Zara. You owe me. Tell the judge you made a mistake. Tell them Estelle was confused. Please." Zara listened to the frantic, sweating desperation bleeding through the speaker. For 30 years, that specific voice had commanded her, belittled her, and made her feel entirely insignificant. Now stripped of his tailored suits and his heavy mahogany desk, he just sounded pathetic. He sounded incredibly small. "You did not give me a life, Jerome," Zara stated, her tone smooth, collected, and completely untroubled. "You gave me an obstacle course. You tried to chemically sedate and discard the woman who actually raised you all to fund a fraudulent real estate scam for a man who despises you. I do not owe you a single dime, and I certainly do not owe you my guilt." "But Zara, please, you have the power to fix this," Jerome begged, the arrogant facade entirely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a terrified old man facing the consequences of his own greed. "I already fixed it," Zara replied. She reached down and tapped the red button, cutting the connection instantly. The line went dead. She navigated to her settings, selected his contact file, and firmly pressed block. The emotional cord, frayed and toxic for decades, was finally permanently severed. She let out a long, slow breath, feeling the phantom weight of her family's expectations dissolve into the quiet morning air. The heavy grooved tires of the pickup truck crunched satisfyingly against the familiar gravel. Zara rolled the windows down, letting the warm, heavy Georgia breeze flood the cabin. The air out here always smelled different, a rich grounding mixture of damp earth, sweet pine, and ancient oak trees. Grandma Estelle sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting comfortably in her lap, a serene, deeply peaceful smile lifting the corners of her mouth as she surveyed her land. Zara slowed the truck as they approached the main gate of the Washington estate. A few weeks ago, this entrance had been littered with Trent's aggressive glossy marketing materials and heavy metal stakes. Now the wooden fence posts stood clean weathered and bare. The glaring neon "sold" signs were entirely gone, replaced only by the deep, undisturbed roots of a legacy that had finally permanently been secured. The heavy iron gates of the Washington estate stood wide open, no longer guarded by Trent's aggressive corporate padlocks. Zara parked her truck near the sprawling wraparound porch, killing the engine. The silence that rushed into the cabin was entirely different from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the courthouse. It was the sound of breathing room. It was the sound of a bloodline taking its land back. Over the next 6 weeks, Zara transformed the property into a literal and figurative construction zone. She hired a team of elite specialized local contractors, explicitly instructing them to strip away every single modernization Jerome and Vivian had inflicted upon the main house. The gaudy imported marble countertops Vivian had installed to impress her country club friends were smashed to pieces and hauled away in industrial dumpsters. The sterile, cold lighting fixtures, the ridiculous imported wallpaper, and the pretentious modern art were all torn out and discarded without a second thought. The heavy velvet drapes that blocked out the Georgia sun were ripped down, replaced by simple sheer linen that let the light pour in. Zara supervised every single detail, ensuring the house was returned to its original breathing state. She brought back the warm, honey-colored oak floors and restored the original brick masonry of the massive kitchen hearth. She hired local artisans to repair the custom millwork around the door frames and polish the antique brass hardware. It was not just a physical renovation, it was a calculated, deliberate exorcism. She was systematically scrubbing her parents' toxic, pretentious energy from the very walls of the estate. Grandma Estelle thrived in the newly cleared space. The transformation in the elderly woman was nothing short of miraculous. Completely detoxed from the heavy, unauthorized psychiatric sedatives Vivian had been slipping into her meals, Estelle moved with a sharp, vibrant energy that completely defied her 82 years. She no longer sat vacant and trembling in a wheelchair, staring blankly at the wall. Instead, she was up at dawn, the rich scent of cinnamon and rising yeast filling the restored kitchen. She baked her famous sweet potato bread, a recipe Jerome had always banned from the house because he claimed it smelled too rustic for his wealthy guests. Zara would sit at the large farmhouse table, drinking black coffee, while Estelle moved effortlessly between the oven and the cutting board. Her hands were steady, her mind was razor-sharp, and her spirit was entirely unbroken. During the cool, humid Georgia afternoons, they walked the property line together. Estelle leaned on a hand-carved hickory walking stick, pointing out the ancient oak trees and the stone boundary markers her own grandfather had laid down a century ago. She pointed out the exact spot by the creek where her father had built the first irrigation trench by hand. She spoke freely, sharing the rich, complicated family history Jerome had desperately tried to silence. She told Zara about the blood, the sweat, and the sheer force of will it took for a black family to hold on to 1,000 acres of prime agricultural land through decades of hostility, economic downturns, and predatory developers. She recounted the names of the neighbors who had tried to run them off the land in the 1950s and exactly how her family had stood their ground. Jerome had always viewed the farm as a primitive embarrassment, a dusty stepping stone to his corporate Atlanta penthouse. He wanted to pave over his history to make himself more palatable to his billionaire investors. Estelle made sure Zara understood the truth. The farm was not an embarrassment. It was a fortress. It was a monument to their survival. While the physical house was being rebuilt, Zara was quietly executing the final, devastating legal maneuver to ensure Trent's greedy vision could never be resurrected. She utilized the massive liquid capital of the family trust to hire a boutique historic preservation law firm based in Washington, D.C. She compiled Estelle's oral histories, gathered original land deeds dating back to the late 1800s, and collected extensive photographic evidence of the property's historical significance. The preservation lawyers worked relentlessly, moving the application through the federal bureaucracy with unprecedented speed. The State Historical Society endorsed the application unanimously. Zara submitted a comprehensive bulletproof dossier to the federal government. She did not just clear the property titles, she officially permanently placed the Washington estate onto the National Register of Historic Places. The designation was an absolute legal fortress. It rendered the entire 1,000-acre farm permanently immune from corporate eminent domain commercial zoning changes and large-scale residential development. No matter what happened in the future, no matter who eventually inherited the land, it could never be paved over. It could never be chopped up and sold to the highest bidder. Trent's ridiculous illegal golf course was not just dead. The very concept of it was now a federal impossibility. On a warm Tuesday morning, exactly 2 months after the courtroom explosion, Zara walked into the kitchen carrying a heavy rolled-up cardboard tube. Estelle was standing at the stove, humming softly as she stirred a large copper pot of fresh peach preserves. The morning sun illuminated the clean lines of the restored kitchen, highlighting the absolute peace that had finally settled over the house. Zara cleared a space on the expansive newly installed butcher block island. She unrolled the large sheets of paper, placing heavy ceramic coffee mugs on the corners to keep them flat. The crisp blue lines of the architectural schematics spread out across the smooth wood. Estelle wiped her hands on her apron, walking over to inspect the documents. She adjusted her reading glasses, her sharp eyes scanning the detailed elevations, the structural diagrams, and the precise property boundaries drawn perfectly to scale. Zara stood beside her grandmother, tracing a finger over the largest structure on the page. It was not a golf course. It was a state-of-the-art agricultural incubator, a sprawling, sustainable community center designed specifically to educate and empower the next generation of Black farmers. Estelle ran her weathered fingers over the crisp, blue lines of the architectural schematics, her eyes filling with bright, unashamed tears. She looked up at me, her smile radiating a kind of profound, triumphant joy that instantly erased decades of my father's oppressive, suffocating control. We were not just saving the land, we were giving it a completely new vital purpose. 6 months later, the heavy Georgia heat hung over the Washington estate like a warm, comforting blanket. I sat beside Grandma Estelle on the freshly painted wraparound porch, 2 sweating glasses of sweet iced tea resting on the small wicker table between us. The rhythmic squeak of her wooden rocking chair provided a soothing soundtrack to the vibrant, bustling symphony of the farm. The terrifying silence of her previous isolation was entirely gone, replaced by the loud, joyous sounds of actual, meaningful progress. Out in the lower 40 acres, right where Trent had planned to bulldoze the rich topsoil for his arrogant, exclusionary 18th hole, a fleet of bright green tractors moved in synchronized precision. Dozens of young, ambitious agricultural students were walking the long rows, examining soil samples, charting irrigation lines, and taking meticulous notes. The new community center, funded entirely out of pocket by my own environmental science firm, stood proudly near the edge of the ancient tree line. Its solar-paneled roof gleamed under the late afternoon sun. It was a massive, fully equipped educational facility featuring cutting-edge soil testing laboratories, modern lecture halls, and a cooperative distribution hub. We had turned my grandmother's heritage into a living, breathing sanctuary for people who genuinely respected the earth and understood the value of hard work. Jerome had spent his entire life trying to aggressively scrub the dirt from his hands. He viewed this historic farm as a primitive, embarrassing stain on his corporate Atlanta resume. He wanted sterile, concrete, exclusive golf memberships and the empty transactional validation of wealthy men who would never truly view him as an equal. He and Vivian had almost destroyed the woman who gave them everything simply to finance a desperate, fraudulent mirage. Now Jerome was sitting in a federal penitentiary, his assets completely liquidated, his reputation entirely pulverized by the justice system. Vivian was living in a cramped budget apartment entirely cut off from the society friends who had instantly abandoned her the moment the indictment hit the press. Aaliyah was working the night shift at a big box retailer, learning the harsh, unforgiving lessons of the real world she used to ruthlessly mock. They had chased an illusion of power and lost absolutely everything. Estelle took a slow sip of her sweet tea, her eyes tracking a group of laughing students carrying heavy wooden crates of freshly harvested heirloom tomatoes toward the distribution hub. She was thriving in a way I had not seen since I was a small child. The heavy, unauthorized sedatives that Vivian had used to keep her quiet and compliant were completely purged from her system. She was awake, alert, and full of life. She was baking every morning, filling the restored farmhouse with the scent of cinnamon and rising dough. She was walking her property line every single day without a wheelchair, and she was teaching the new generation the vital oral history of our ancestors. She was the undisputed matriarch of a thriving empire respected and revered by every single person who stepped foot onto the Washington estate. I leaned back against the wooden porch railing, letting the warm, fragrant breeze wash over me. For 30 years I had exhausted myself trying to decipher the impossible cruel puzzle of my parents' love. I had chased their approval, internalized their harsh criticisms, and believed the highly toxic lie that my worth was somehow tied to their conditional acceptance. I had allowed myself to be the designated family scapegoat, absorbing their collective dysfunction, because I thought that was simply the unavoidable price of belonging. But looking out at the sprawling, successful empire I had protected, and looking at the grandmother I had saved from a terrible fate, the final heavy chain of my childhood trauma simply snapped and fell away. I realized with absolute and unwavering clarity that my worth was never tied to Jerome's arrogant demands or Vivian's icy, superficial judgment. My worth was tied directly to my own integrity. It was tied to the calluses on my hands, the rigorous education I paid for myself, and the unwavering courage it took to stand up in a federal courtroom and tear down their fraudulent predatory empire. I did not need their validation to be a true Washington. I was the only one in my immediate family who actually understood what that powerful name meant. I was the one who defended the soil. I was the one who honored the ancestors who had bled to keep this land. I had taken the very worst parts of my family history and transformed them into a foundation for something incredibly beautiful and entirely untouchable. The sun began to dip below the towering oak trees, casting a brilliant, fiery orange glow across the sprawling, productive fields. Estelle reached out, placing her warm, steady hand over mine. We did not need to say a single word to each other. The thriving, vibrant farm spoke for us. It was a massive monument to resilience, a testament to the undeniable power of truth, and a permanent legal fortress against greed. They tried to bury us, not realizing we were seeds. Have you ever had to cut the dead branches off your family tree so you could finally grow? Let me know in the comments. Remember, your legacy is what you build, not what you tolerate. True worth is never defined by the approval of those who consistently tear you down. The most profound liberation comes from walking away from toxic environments and quietly building your own success. Bloodlines do not automatically entitle anyone to your peace, your resources, or your presence. Real family is built on a foundation of mutual respect, not manipulation or control. When you stop seeking validation from people committed to misunderstanding you, you finally reclaim your power and build a legacy on your own terms. Share your journey of overcoming toxic family dynamics in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering stories.